We are just going to welcome Dr. Dana Moss. She is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. She has been awarded multiple grants to conduct fieldwork in the Arab world, including the National Science Foundation's Doctoral Dissertation Improvement Grant and the American Institute for Yemeni Studies Predoctoral Fellowship. In 2009, Dr. Moss co-founded the Yemen Peace Project, a nonprofit in operation from 2010 until 2019, dedicated to educating Americans about Yemeni politics and the arts. Dr. Moss, we are so delighted that you've joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima, for such a kind and generous introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be with all of you today, and I just want to thank all of you for your hard work, dedication, and service to all of your students over the past few years. I know that conditions have been utterly impossible, and I am just in awe of you all. I had a brief stint myself, actually, as a public school teacher, so I have a sense, I would say, about how hard it can be. And yeah, so thank you all again. Skipping ahead a little bit here. So yeah, I thank you, Kristen, Emma, Abdulrahman, for bringing me here. What I'm going to start by doing is giving you all a little background about how I got interested in Yemen and really fell in love with it as a place, got to know its culture, many of its people, and how I've continued to integrate it into my research and my teaching, even though I haven't been able to travel back to the country in a little while because of the wars and because of the very tragic situations that have been happening. And then, you know, we're gonna get through as much as we can get through, and my alarm is gonna go off at 6:04. And then from there, I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. And if I can't answer them, I can certainly find a way to direct us towards the right resources, and perhaps Rima and the team can send that out later. So thank you again. I love the questions that came up in a chat, and hopefully I get a chance to answer some of those along the way. I was wondering too, if maybe just to start off, if you could also enter into the chat, if you're available to do so, what kind of words come to mind when you think about Yemen? These could be words or descriptors that you've heard on the news. These could just be things that are, you know, stereotypes that you've heard. But I think it would be really interesting for me to get a sense of that, so that I know kind of from where we're starting. As Rima, I'm sure, is also familiar, a lot of times we're sort of preaching to the choir, right? Like we're presenting about Yemen to people who know a lot about Yemen. But in this case, I'm really excited to hear about what you all have heard, what you all know. Okay, so we hear about sanctions, we hear about Islam, kindness, that's lovely, famine, water issues, 100%, coffee, kahwa, absolutely. Right, so it's a big mix of things. I think probably we'll be touching on all of those today, and feel free to continue to contribute. All right, so let me make sure I can advance the slides. Here we go. So just to situate us within the Arab world, Yemen is located on sort of the heel of the Arabian Peninsula within the Middle Eastern Arab majority world. Its capital city is Sana'a. You can see hopefully here it's the largest dot sort of in the middle of the country. And as you can see, it's bordered by the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. So it's not just one of these landlocked countries. And so it's just to the south of Saudi Arabia and just to the west of Oman. As you can see, it's also close to a lot of these African countries, and is actually not just a country that people are trying to leave because there has been such a severe crisis there that we're going to talk about, but is also, it's a receiving country of people who are also fleeing their countries due to famine and war as well. So if you have any questions about migration in and out of Yemen, that's one of my main areas of research right now, and I'd be happy to talk about that. To move on just a little bit, also, again, you get a little picture about where it is. I just also wanted to acknowledge that it was only in 1990 that Yemen became the unified Republic of Yemen that we know of it today. Prior to that time, some of you may be old enough to have remembered that Yemen at one time was North Yemen, the Yemen Arab Republic, and for a long time, much longer than a lot of its neighbors, it was essentially an imamate. It was more of a closed society run by, you know, a more like conservative, I would say authoritarian system. And then in the south, you actually had the Arab world's only socialist state. It was one of the, allies of the Soviet Union. And so it's very interesting how these two countries have merged into one. That really has affected a lot of the conflicts that have subsequently come in recent years. So I just wanted to alert everyone to that as well. Yemen, I think one of the first things I think about with my travels to Yemen, the things I have around my house that remind me of Yemen, is the absolutely stunning, gorgeous cultural legacy that it brings. One of the folks early on said, how is Yemen distinct from some of its neighbors? One of the reasons that it is distinct is because it has extremely old, some of the oldest inhabited cities and places in the world. So you might think of Damascus, you might think of other places that have been inhabited for thousands of years. So too has Yemen. And it's been a really rich, distinct culture full of artistry. Yemeni Jewish silver work and jewelry is some of the finest there is. There aren't many people of Jewish descent left in Yemen. Most of them have gone to Israel. But still, when you go everywhere, the jewelry is just fabulous. On the right here side of the screen, you'll see the famous jambia. And if you're familiar with other parts of the region, you might see other versions of the jambia, but the Yemeni version is one of the most stunning. A lot of times people and men, particularly in the northern regions, will wear this, and it's not menacing or anything of that nature, but it's a beautiful symbolic symbol of their culture, and it's oftentimes used in traditional dances. People, when they dress up, they wear this beautiful jambia dagger. And another thing that Yemen is quite is not as well known for as it should be, is that it's really the source of the world's coffee. It's the original coffee producer. And here you see at the bottom screen a man holding the very young coffee beans, essentially the berries that are used to make coffee. And it's been a major exporter of coffee for a long time. And ironically, there isn't a big coffee culture in Yemen. Every time I would go to Yemen, people would offer me Nescafe, which was really hilarious, because they primarily export it, but they do oftentimes boil the shells of the coffee berries and make a kind of tea with that called kishr. So that was really interesting too. So Yemen is extremely, it's got this ancient culture. It's, just the artistry is absolutely gorgeous. The food is it's home to food that oftentimes we take for granted. But I also want to emphasize that it's not just this, ancient place. I don't want us to be thinking about it in a kind of Orientalist sense as a place without a contemporary culture and history. And in fact, that place really merges a lot of what we might think of as contemporary culture, youth culture, urban culture, a merge of East meets West, North meets South, in addition to some of these more traditional flavors, so to speak. Something that some of you might find interesting to show to your classes, particularly at the middle and high school level, is this wonderful documentary that I might be able to scrounge up a few extra copies of, called Shake the Dust. And what it does is it highlights youth all over the developing world, all over the global south, from Venezuela to Uganda to Yemen, who are engaged in breakdancing. And we find that actually a lot of youth in Yemen have taken up these kinds of hobbies, such as breakdancing, such as parkour, to really reclaim parts of their environment, to kind of merge what they consider to be their culture with more cosmopolitan or international culture, and the ways that they've really made it their own. And it's a really, really exciting, fun documentary that I love, and I think young people absolutely love it too. So I just wanted to put that out there as something that I have observed and enjoyed learning about. Another thing that's really fascinating about Yemen is, particularly in the north city, the capital city of Sana'a, you have this old city of Sana'a, which is a walled city. And as you can see, the houses here are essentially made of mud and alabaster brick. And again, this is some of the oldest continuously inhabited architecture in the world. And they kind of look a little bit like gingerbread houses. In fact, a lot of the times people refer to them that way. And I just wanted to give you a shot that I took for when I was studying Arabic there many years ago. But one of the things that we ended up doing when we my partner and I, we went to a New Year's party a couple of years ago and people were making gingerbread houses. And so we actually made, we actually made our own Yemeni versions of these gingerbread houses, which was really fun. And so when I was just thinking about, well, what's a fun way to incorporate Yemen into a class activity? This could be done with cereal and graham crackers and frosting, because the architecture is really stunning. This isn't something you find, I don't think, anywhere else in the world. And there's a place called Shibam in sort of central East Yemen, which is known as like the Manhattan of the desert. It's really the first evidence that we have existing, not evidence, but I should say lasting architectural artifacts of like skyscrapers. The first man-made skyscrapers essentially come from Yemen, which is really interesting. So this is a beautiful shot of the old city. So I just wanted to also, I know that Rima in her kind introduction mentioned that I'd studied Arabic there. This is just a few shots of me many years ago now. This 2009 with some of our teachers, some of our wonderful guides, also us falling asleep in the heat and humidity while trying to get our studies done. I just like that picture because I was like, yep, that's how it would be after many, many hours of study. But it was just an absolutely wonderful place to learn Arabic because, as some of you may know, there are a lot of regional dialects and colloquial kind of flavors of the language. And so if you go, to the Bedouin, villages of Morocco, the kinds of Arabic you'll hear will be very different from what you might hear in Lebanon or Yemen, Jordan, or Saudi, Iraq, or some other place. But it was a wonderful place because we learned a lot of the modern standard Arabic, and then we learned some of the different Yemeni dialects as well. And it's a shame that students can't go. Well, I hope in my lifetime we'll see students be able to go back to Yemen because it was just such a fabulous place to learn. And people were so kind and interested in helping us to practice. So again, I just threw up some more images just to really emphasize the beauty of the place. And this is one of, unfortunately, the downsides of the war that's going on is some of this heritage, these UNESCO World Heritage Sites are very much in danger, if not already been destroyed. So this is one of the things that is being impacted certainly by the war, but is a legacy that I think will outlast the war as well. All right, so, and I also wanted to because I think, of course, given the stereotypes that we grow up with about the Arab world, a lot of people think desert or they maybe think beach, but Yemen has every single type of sort of climate and topography that you can imagine. It's mountainous, it's got flat beaches, it's got some of the hottest inhabited places in the world. The city of Zabid can be in the 120s degrees, in the summertime, and that was even before climate change really took a spike. So I remember going to this animal sanctuary in the Tahama in the summer and thinking I'd literally stepped out of the bus into an oven. It was unbelievable, but absolutely stunning, as you can see. Some places in the mountains are freezing. So we sometimes would set out on a field trip and be, looking at this masjid or meeting these folks. And then all of a sudden it would start hailing and we'd be shivering, right? So it's like the climate, the variation, everything you can possibly imagine in that place. And here are some of the folks we met along our travels. This is the Red Sea where we were staying, which, it was like stepping into a bath. It was that warm. It was the strangest experience. I wasn't expecting that. And in the south, just to give you a little bit more of a sort of a visual sense of what's going on, you have Elephant Bay in the top left corner. You can see that there's sort of this trunk-like arch. And that's one of the famous sort of landmarks of the southern beaches. Aden was the original capital of South Yemen. There was an important port there. It was occupied by the British for many decades. It was occupied by the Ottomans before that. And you can see there are just stunning views of this place. So I think visually, partly what's so fascinating about Yemen is its architectural variety, the history there. You go to the United Arab Emirates and everything there is practically brand new. It's like being in the United States, right? In terms of the architecture at least, but Yemen has this much older history. And, if you went to South Yemen, you'd go to fish markets, you'd look at the old wells that were built during the Ottoman time. And you would see a lot of cultural and even linguistic distinction between places in the north, places in the south, and so forth. This is the Manhattan of the desert that I was talking about before. This is Shibam in sort of central east Yemen. And as you can see, it's just a remarkable visual looking place. I was unfortunately not, it wasn't safe enough for us to go there when I was visiting, but I know I have other friends who are journalists and researchers who have been there, and they say it's absolutely incredible, but no elevators, right? So you're in the Manhattan of the desert, but there are no elevators. So you just have to be, you know, prepared and very tough, as my friends would say, to scale these buildings. Okay, so moving on, as Rima mentioned, I was also part of an organization that was run by my partner. I was on the board and active participant in it, and we were really concerned in 2009 that the US-based approach to Yemen was unfolding according to one sort of agenda and one lens, and that was that of counterterrorism. Now, that wasn't totally, you know, random. Yemen had been the site of the development of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, an attack on the USS Cole. But the problem is that under that period, the Obama administration was engaging in a kind of drone warfare, increased drone warfare in Yemen to target terrorists that were actually harming civilians in a huge way. And we were very concerned about this. And we were also very concerned that, again, the only thing people associated with Yemen was Al-Qaeda, maybe Osama bin Laden's birthplace, because this wasn't that long after 9/11, and things of that nature. And there's so much more, as you can see from just the past few slides that I've shown and the few pictures I've, you know, kind of thrown up there really quickly. There's so much more to learn about the people and the place than that. And so that became part of our mission. And, you know, through this journey, I just want to kind of give you a little example of some of the absolutely incredible folks that we've met. I think a lot of times when we show pictures of Yemeni people, we tend to show people who look tribal. They look very foreign to us, you know, modern Americans. But, you know, Yemen also has had this robust development in civil society, people in government who have been working for human rights, for women's rights. And I just wanted to give you a sense of that. So in the far upper left-hand corner, in sort of the beige outfit, is Dr. Rafa Hassan. She's someone who I volunteered for in 2009. Unfortunately, she passed away of an illness just before the revolution that happened in 2011, which I'll touch on briefly. But Dr. Hassan was one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. She'd been working for women's rights, and she ran this little, you know, very humble organization in the middle of Sana'a, right between the new city and the old city. And when I would just sit there and I would be observing what would happen, people would just come to her and say, I need help with this, I need help with that. And she never turned anyone away. And in fact, you know, one day there was some sort of like power surge, because it's power and electricity is very sporadic in Yemen, even when I was there over 10 years ago. And a light fixture above her head exploded into 100 pieces right as she was meeting with someone. And I was just standing there stunned, you know, that she hadn't been killed by this sort of explosion in the room. And she just went, ah, well, another day, you know. And I was just totally blown away by her tenacity. And she also was very wise in that she understood that the environment, the political and sometimes parts of the cultural environment were not very hospitable to talking about women's rights. So what she did is she really focused also on addressing the family. And she did it in a way that Yemenis could understand. She wasn't trying to impose some sort of foreign values on the country, but really she was an advocate as a Yemeni woman for other Yemenis. So that was just one example of someone who I admired very much. In the center here, this young man is Mohammed al-Samawi, and on the right-hand side of his photograph, you can see his memoir. I think that this would be a wonderful book. I don't know how much control you might have over, you know, the curriculum in your classroom, but this could make a wonderful book or suggested reading for students, because what it's about is it's about his journey as a activist, as a person promoting religious freedom and sort of interfaith dialogue in Yemen, which is, you know, 99% Muslim. Of course, people are different varieties. It's slightly majority Sunni, but there are also people who are Shia or maybe, you know, some other sect essentially. So he's working to bring something to Yemen that was quite quite new and scary to some factions. And he actually was literally hunted out of the country. I mean, he had to flee Yemen for his life for doing this. And in part, he was able to flee Yemen because he developed friendships with, foreigners who were Jewish and Christian and other folks all over the world, this kind of youth network over Facebook, and they literally helped him to escape. So he wrote this memoir. I believe it's actually going to be made into a film. I have no idea how truthful, how Hollywood the film will be compared to the memoir. But also Muhammad is, now he's living in Florida, but he's also a disability rights activist as well. He actually has a disability in his arm. And so he's just a really fabulous representation of sort of the activist youth in Yemen who are just continuing to work for change, even though a lot of them have had to leave. So too, very quickly on the far right, you have my friend Atiaf al-Wazir, who's now in exile in France, but she was instrumental participating every day in the peaceful revolution that happened in 2011, documenting what was going on, receiving us when we were coming as guests to meet her. She's an absolutely fabulous person. And then on the bottom, we have my friend Amat al-Alim al-Soswa, Amat was the actual Minister of Human Rights and worked on women's rights issues in Yemen as well before she, was forced to leave and remain in the United States. I believe now she's in Washington, D.C. And she also worked with us in the Yemen Peace Project. So again, I want to give a sense that Yemen has got the kind of leaders, activists, youth, lawyers, professionals, doctors, photographers that any other society has. It's simply that they don't gain as much visibility as many others. And because of the situation in Yemen right now, that a lot of them aren't able to do the work that needs to be done in Yemen. They're now on the outside, but they're still working hard. And I know that as soon as it's safe, they're going to go home and continue to make a difference on the ground. I also do this with my Notre Dame students too, right? So they're not just associating images of Yemen with, a kind of anonymous Al-Qaeda figure or something like that, right? There's like real people doing the real work of social change. And it's absolutely remarkable. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of well, the first thing that always happens when someone as wonderful as Rima or Emma ask me to talk about Yemen and give this like background to people who aren't Yemen people is yay, and then also because it's so complicated. The political situation is very complicated, and I'm just going to give you a sense of how complicated it is, and then I'm happy to answer clarifying questions later. So sort of prior to 2011, and then the subsequent revolution, the subsequent coups, the subsequent wars that have been happening, even then, as one country, power and political power in Yemen, political capacity to run the country was highly decentralized. So in the top far left, you have former President Saleh, who I believe since 1978 was president of North Yemen, and then he became sort of president of the full republic. You have his family members pictured here. You have his generals, Ali Mohsen, pictured just below him. So you have a lot of different factions that have some kind of military power and ostensibly were recognized as sort of the sovereign centralized state of Yemen. But in reality, large parts of Yemen were not, at least in total control, if control at all, of the central Yemeni government run by Saleh. There were tribal leaders, there were Huthi leaders, there were, when we went to Taiz, which is a central city that's unfortunately borne a huge brunt in the current war, we met with the governor one day, and then we'd go meet with the tribal leaders the other day, who essentially had just as much political power. They had their own security services. They ran trade and were involved in businesses. And a lot of times, ordinary people rely on sort of tribal leaders, these almost like city-states, if you will, if you remember like Greek history, right? These kinds of city-states to provide services for them because the government has been had pretty weak capacity. It hasn't had full control over the country. And it's also, there's been a lot of corruption, a lot of authoritarianism, essentially. So sometimes other sort of units below the central state have been relied on to support people, help people, but they've not necessarily been democratic. So when folks like Dr. Hassan or Atiaf or Muhammad, who I mentioned in the last slide, have been working to impact change, it's important to understand that even before things got really chaotic and really desperate, that doing so in a kind of system where there were overlapping folks in power, where you weren't just dealing with like one central government or even a local government, but maybe also a tribal government, maybe also, you know, a general who had some kind of power, military capacity in a particular place, is very, very complicated. And this is what essentially, to like sort of summarize all of that, this is what political scientists typically refer to as a weak state. And it's a weak state because the central government doesn't have full control or capacity. There's a lot of negotiating that has to go on in order for the system to run. In a lot of places, the system doesn't run. A lot of places, people are essentially fending for themselves in a lot of ways and relying on other authorities to, you know, have garbage cleaned up or find clean water or go to the market. So I just wanted to give you a sense about that. Okay, so just to get into, I think we're doing really good for time, just to get into some of the recent roots of the current crisis. It's hard really to think of a problem that Yemen hasn't been facing, unfortunately, in the last few decades. And I just want to emphasize how much at a disadvantage Yemen already was prior to the current internationalized civil wars that have been going on, and the starvation and just a whole host of problems that are going on right now. It was already the poorest country in the Arab world, in the Middle Eastern world. And, you know, it was led by this weak authoritarian regime, as I mentioned, by Ali Abdullah Saleh, who's mentioned, who's depicted in the far left. In addition to that, and I just threw up a few images to give you a sense, you had social movements and other different coalitions active in South Yemen, particularly starting in 2007, who were saying, look, like, we've been merged together as a state now for a few years, and we feel like the neglected and mistreated stepchild of North Yemen. So in other words, we want to become autonomous or independent again. And so folks have mobilized under this old South Yemen flag, which you can see in here, which is red, white, blue, and black. So you've been seeing a lot of contention around the way people have been treated and marginalized in the South. You've had drone strikes. You've had the mobilization of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which a lot of times are recruiting people who simply need a job, right? They're not ideologues. They're not dedicated to implementing some particular kind of Sharia or anything like that. They're simply, you know, this is how they make a living. And because parts of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have embedded themselves, married into civilian areas, it's not easy just to isolate them and target them. And this is one of the reasons that civilian casualties have been high, is the United States is often, and its allies have decided that that's collateral damage worth making, essentially, which is in violation of international law, but we can talk about that later. And in the bottom, you see a photograph of these three men. They're sort of like washed out a little bit. You might have heard the term Houthis bantered around in the news. The Houthis were, I always ask my friends who are real experts on the Houthis themselves, what do we call them, right? Was it a region? Is it a tribe? They say it's really more like akin to a social movement. The Houthis, they follow like a version of Shia Islam, but essentially they were, you know, kind of a social movement that mobilized in North Yemen that was competing for resources and essentially autonomy over their land with Ali Abdullah Saleh. And Saleh essentially declared war on these guys, declared war on this entire people and an entire northern city called Sada for many years. At least 5 times he declared war on these folks. Now, what's very complicated is that during the revolution, which I'll talk about, the Houthis joined with the popular revolution against Saleh, right? To say, like, you're a dictator, you need to get out. That makes perfect sense. But now they have captured power. They're running parts of Yemen like a totalitarian kind of regime. They're extremely illiberal, and there's just a lot of issues there. So just to say that there are other social movements that have been competing with Saleh for power for a long time. Some of those have kind of been beaten, and some of those have gotten stronger, and the Houthis are one of them. There's also, I'll just say this before I move on, there's a longstanding discourse on CNN and Fox and others that, they're Iran sponsored. The Houthis are Iran sponsored. I want to make it very clear that the Houthis are Yemeni. They are not just some sort of foreign satellite for Iran. And many, many, many years prior to Iran doing anything and meddling at all in Yemen, the Houthis were mobilizing to have their own autonomy. It's only more recently that Iran's gotten involved. So if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it. It's just vastly oversimplistic to say the Iran backed this, because yeah, anyway. All right, so leading up to what's going on, it's very important to understand and recall, and it's hard to believe now how long it's been. I tell my students, you were playing Pokemon. I mean, this was like, in 2011, I can't believe it. So a lot of the students may not remember, but it's worth remembering for us, especially that in 2011, these revolutions, referred to as the Arab Spring, spread across the Middle Eastern region. They started in Tunisia, and then they spread to Egypt. We saw massive protests and now an extreme humanitarian crisis in Syria, a civil war in Libya, and also in Yemen and Bahrain also. But what was remarkable is that even though Yemen is the second most heavily armed nation on earth, and second only to the United States, I might add, we're number one, okay? And I just find it really fun to see the looks on students' faces when I tell them that. Yemen is the second most heavily armed nation on earth. Nevertheless, they had one of the most peaceful revolutions to oust Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator who I showed you before, from power during this protest wave. So during this time, people gathered in major cities across the country. They marched, they prayed, they protested, they put on performances, they held art shows to try to pressure Saleh and his allies to get him to abdicate power, essentially to step down from the presidency. And this is something that had been on the globe's radar for some time, because Saleh had been making moves essentially to become sort of Yemen's eternal president like Mubarak, and to essentially eventually hand over power to his son. So in other words, to undo the very nascent democratic structure of Yemen as a republic, and to sort of just continue this as sort of a family caliphate, for lack of a better word. So in any case, Yemenis knew this very well. I think Saleh vastly overcounted how popular he was in his own country. And over the course of these peaceful protests, there were massacres. He sent armed thugs and security forces to shoot down peaceful protesters. There were many such incidences. So from Aden to Taz to Sana'a, the capital, students, ordinary people formed these massive coalitions to say, we're not going to stand for this. And in addition, the United Nations was also continuously asking Saleh to step down. Once the United Nations put sanctions on Saleh as of November, he finally capitulated to what was called the GCC agreement. It's kind of a detail, but the Gulf Cooperation Council agreement, which was spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, essentially said, okay, here's a roadmap to transition Saleh out of the presidency and to form an election. Of course, we should know, given Saudi Arabia's own governance structure, that anything that they propose is suspect, right? Especially when it's ostensibly supporting democracy. But I can explain why that is later. But essentially the point is, the protesters succeeded. They succeeded by sheer force of will, organizing power. Almost all of the different activists I showed you before played a huge role in keeping people mobilized, keeping people informed, keeping people's spirits up for months and months as this revolution was going on. We saw women play a huge role in this revolution. We also saw a lot of different security forces defect and essentially lay down their weapons and side with the revolution. So too did a lot of tribes, again, that were operating like these nation states and other parts of Yemen, come to the squares and actually join protesters, not to be violent, but just to say, if you attack members of our tribe, we will retaliate. So in that way, they provided a layer of protection at times for protesters. It was a complex dynamic. I'm happy to elaborate on that. But as you could, and I just want to also point out that the men that you see on the right-hand side are holding up these red cards. And if anybody's familiar with soccer, or football everywhere else in the world, right? Not American football, but international football or soccer. If you get a red card, you're thrown out of the game. And so what the revolutionaries did is they were holding up these red cards to tell Saleh to get out, which was really cool. We also saw the emergence during this time of Tawakkol Karman, who won a Nobel Peace Prize towards the end of the revolution. Now, she was a longtime activist in Yemen, and she ran an organization called, I believe, Women Journalists Without Chains, is the right translation. So she was a journalist, she was doing independent reporting, she was very critical of the regime. Now, since then, her role has become a little bit more controversial, but the point is to understand that she's the first Yemeni of any kind. I believe this only the second Arab woman in the entire world to ever win a Nobel Prize. And it was done to recognize her longtime activism, supporting women and the free press in Yemen, but also it was a nod, certainly by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, to her work in leading the revolution. The Saleh regime actually tried to imprison her. They did imprison her at the beginning. And what she ended up doing was organizing the prisoners to protest for their rights in the prison. So because she did that, actually, they ended up releasing her and she rejoined the revolution itself. So you really couldn't hold her down. And she was just really one of sort of the bright shining moments, or really encapsulated the resilience, the role of women in this, and the peaceful nature of the revolution, again, in a country that's really known for war and chaos and violence. So I thought that was important to mention. And if anybody did, projects on different Nobel Peace Prize winners, it would be so cool to have students emphasize this as well, for what she's done. It was really an incredible moment, and Yemenis were very proud. I think Yemenis have been treated, I don't know if this is the right metaphor, but, a lot of times people in the United States castigate people who are from the South, maybe like from Arkansas or Mississippi or something like that, as just being ignorant, backwards, uncultured, whatever it is. Yemenis are treated a lot of times that way in the broader Arab world, and certainly by their northern cousin, Saudi Arabia, who uses Yemen as a source of migrant labor. And so, to really have Tawakkol Karman come out as a prominent sort of a person from this set of events was really, really important, and it instilled a sense of like dignity and pride to Yemenis and Yemen as a country, I think, at a time where it's sort of been like, treated like the ugly stepchild, essentially, of the region. Okay, so again, the protesters did succeed, along with pressure from the United Nations and other countries, to force Saleh temporarily from power. And then the following February in 2012, the former Vice President Hadi was elected to sort of lead this transition. Okay, so there was going to be all kinds of dialogues, and there was this huge dialogue between all the different partners of the revolution, the Houthis, the youth, the students, the Islamist party, all these different groups to figure out, okay, what's the future of Yemen going to be? And one thing I noticed when I was there during the transition was that there was really this beautiful emergence and sort of resurgence of civil society, and civil society art, activism, education that had really emerged during the revolution. It was given some space to breathe and grow during this transition. I found that the discourse in the media is Yemen had a revolution, and then it led directly to this war. And that's wrong. There was this transition period of over 2 years where Yemen was safer than ever before. Well, maybe not ever before, but vastly safer than it had been. And you had this emergence of people really reclaiming urban space and giving new forms of expression. So people were commemorating the victims of violence during the revolution. People were expressing pride, as you could see. Different artists were using this opportunity to express themselves and express their culture and their pride. And I just thought that was really, really remarkable. That was a really positive change of the revolution too. Unfortunately, given that not only did the revolution provide new space for civil society, it also provided opportunities for spoilers and for other armed movements to try to mobilize to take a piece of the pie, especially because they weren't confident that under the new government and the new administration that they would be given what they wanted. both rightly and wrongly. So what happened was the Houthis, so as I mentioned, were a part of the revolution and a peaceful part of the revolution for a long time. Some of their armed factions and some of their more cosmopolitan political elites, I would say, mobilized essentially. They formed a coalition with the deposed president, who under the Saudi agreement was allowed to stay in Yemen, which was a huge, huge, huge mistake. They mobilized with the former president and all of the security forces that remained loyal to him and his son and his cousins. They mobilized together to essentially overthrow the Hadi government. It was a lot more complicated than that. It took place over the series of several months, but essentially what happened is Hadi was forced to flee from the capital to the south from where he's from to Saudi Arabia. And essentially, this government in exile was formed while the Houthis took over and essentially fought a war to try to capture this territory that had never been centralized, had never been governed by one entity before. And this, of course, made the Houthis hugely unpopular because they're waging war most of the time on their own people. So that is sort of the basis of a lot of the war that has followed since, a lot of the international intervention that's followed since. And I'm going to come back to that, but I just want to briefly sort of bring you to where this led me, which is that what I noticed, and I planned to do, my dissertation and be in Yemen, but because of these various developments, I ironically couldn't be there. Well, one thing I noticed is that as the transition period fell apart, Hadi had to flee, the president had to flee Yemen, and this war emerged, that actually activists and Yemenis all over the world began to mobilize also to help their compatriots, to raise awareness about what was going on. And I found that not only did they do so, in the war's aftermath, but they did so during the revolutions themselves. And so I just put out a book about this process, not looking just at the Yemeni case, but also the Syrian and Libyan case, to try to understand how people outside of their home country mobilize during these incredible crises to help people within, and how that dynamic plays out. So if anybody's interested in that, let me know, because Cambridge is actually going to put out a free ebook, a free e-version of this book, which they priced at an insane amount of money as a hardback, but it's going to be free as of next month. So if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to send you the link as soon as it's available. Just wanted to let you know about that. And I'm also continuing to find that, and I'll if we have time, I can mention this, that in light of the 2016 election and the rise of sort of refugee bans, Muslim bans, and the banning of refugees and visa holders from countries like Yemen, you've also seen an increase in advocacy of Yemeni Americans and different folks who are saying, look, we are American. We've lived in New York for decades. We picked fruit in the farm workers movement in the 1960s in California. We helped to manufacture cars in Michigan for all this time. We've been here. We're Americans. We're part of this society. And it's incredibly discriminatory, if not downright racist and Islamophobic, to be excluding us, especially when we're trying to flee the very terrorists that you're afraid of, right? It's been statistically shown that the people who are most likely in the world to be victims of extremism are oftentimes the very people that we exclude because we're afraid, because they're associated. So Syrians, Yemenis, Libyans, right? These folks are trying to flee the same things that Americans are afraid of, but they get caught in the crossfire essentially. So I just wanted to acknowledge that Yemeni Americans are also mobilizing to defend their civil and political rights and to be more visible in society, to say look, we're here, we're Americans, and we deserve fair treatment. And we can also talk about how 9/11 impacted this community if anybody's interested. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I've got a repeat of some slides here. Okay, so what we have, unfortunately, is that since Hadi, just to picture him again here, was deposed and has been ostensibly Yemen's president in exile now since 2015, and he really has no control. What happened was the Houthi takeover of the capital gave Saudi Arabia, essentially, an excuse to wage war against their longtime rivals. And they've been geographical rivals, political rivals, ideological rivals for a long time. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and this coalition of folks, which include the United States and Britain, mobilized to try to fight the Houthis and quash them, get rid of them. But as I mentioned, you can't just sort of dig the Houthi movement out of Yemen as if it's a tumor, right? And just pluck it out and throw it away. Houthis are Yemenis too. And they succeeded with Saleh, with some of their allies, to take control or at least get a foothold in large parts of Yemen. So when the Saudi-led coalition, again supported by the United States, started bombing Yemen to try to push back the Houthis and oust them out of power, this has created an untenable humanitarian crisis that is unparalleled anywhere in the world. I mean, according to the United Nations, it's the worst there is. And there are a lot of rivals, right? Afghanistan, Somalia, Ukraine now, Syria for all these years. Yemen's population is about 30 million. Here it's estimated as 28.7. Okay, fine. We don't really know. There's never like a full census that's taken place, but it's around 30 million. And what we show is at least 22.2 million people need humanitarian aid. Most people are lacking access to clean water and sanitation. If anybody's ever smelled an open sewer, you have a sense of what I'm talking about. This was already a huge problem prior to the war, but it became even worse, obviously. Lack of water, lack of food. We already had a lack of hospitals, a lack of doctors, a lack of regular power and electricity, a lack of vaccinations, an internal displacement crisis. All of this has gotten horrible. And on top of this, you also have issues related to desertification and climate change that are impacting Yemen, environmental challenges. It's just about anything you can name. I mean, literally, I one day was browsing my Yemen news and it was like plague of locusts, you know, and it's almost like you want to cry because it's like, what aren't the Yemeni people dealing with right now? But I do want to also emphasize that this is largely a man-made problem. The perpetual war between the Saudi coalition and Houthi forces, Houthis, by the way, eventually lost Saleh as an ally. Saleh became a little bit estranged with them and then was killed during the war. So it's essentially a Saudi-led coalition versus the Houthi movement versus other actors like the Southern Transitional Council, like Al-Qaeda. Again, it's very complicated. It's very, very difficult to get into the nitty-gritty. But the point is that there are a lot of different belligerent actors on the ground operating, fighting for control, fighting for resources, fighting for power. And there's no real good guy in this conflict. Hadi, essentially from Riyadh, has allowed, or at least been watching, his country be destroyed by Saudi Arabia and their allies. And he's lost total legitimacy. And then who are you going to get to, you know, ally with or partner on the ground who isn't essentially going to be a problem for any of their foreign allies later? I mean, this is like a huge, huge issue. And one of the reasons why it's so perpetual. So as you can see from this map, this is a very overgeneralized, by the way, but it's about as simple, it's as simplified as it can be. The areas of control as of last year in Yemen, they're still about the same. You have in red these kind of Houthi areas, Houthi-run areas. You have sort of coalition forces that are running things sort of colonizing parts of Yemen. And then you have southern forces that have long been mobilizing for autonomy and independence with control of some parts. You have an Al-Qaeda presence. You have all different sets of actors, as I said, fighting for control continuously. Even when I last presented for UNC to talk about COVID in Yemen, which I'll touch on before we close, the situation was about the same. And Saudi Arabia had, even though it's gotten less and less press coverage, Saudi Arabia is continuing to bomb parts of Yemen. And I'm talking basic essential infrastructures, wells, hospitals, schools. And they're doing so because the United States enables them to do so. We provide logistical support. We and the Great Britain and other countries, other Western countries, sell them the weapons that they need to do this. In a lot of ways, it might be accurate to say that Yemen is, in a way, like the USSR's Afghanistan, or the United States, Vietnam. They're involved in this perpetual war that they cannot win. Okay, that's a losing war that's leading to the decimation of a civilian population. And I've got to be honest with you all to say that the only reason we don't hear about famine in Yemen is because Saudi Arabia and its allies exert a lot of influence in the United Nations to actually prevent us from using that word. And it sounds cynical and it might sound conspiratorial, but that's unfortunately the truth. Saudi Arabia has had a major role, if you can believe it, on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And they have a lot of influence in saying we're not allowed, or we're not going to allow, or we're going to discourage or pressure other countries not to use the word famine when it comes to Yemen, because that would provoke a kind of international response that we don't want. That would essentially provoke negative publicity. But I'm sorry to say that there has been a famine. We've been hearing a lot of rhetoric. I've been hearing rhetoric for over 10 years about Yemen being on the brink of this and on the brink of that. And for a long time, we were hearing about Yemen being on the brink of famine. Well, ostensibly the famine's here. You may have seen over the last few years pictures in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or other, maybe the Chicago Tribune about, just literally starving Yemeni children. It's utterly devastating. It's utterly heartbreaking. But unfortunately, as always, Yemen is very much marginalized in the international community and is not getting the resources it needs to even begin to address this problem, even though there are a lot of very valiant humanitarian aid workers on the ground doing their best. There's just a resource shortage. There's an attention deficit when it comes to Yemen, and this is a perpetual problem. So as you can see, these are some of the photos I'm talking about. These are some of the victims of bombings. We have an influx and a mobilization of child soldiers on all different sides of this conflict. At the bottom, bordered in yellow, you can see a school bus that was actually bombed with a US-made cluster bomb, cluster ammunition, that killed a school bus full of children. So here we have this horrific situation that was already a major problem. Most schools have been destroyed. There are millions of children not getting any school. There are millions of people who have been displaced, mostly within Yemen, because they can't get out of Yemen. And we have the UK, the US, Canada, continuing to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, which is perpetuating this problem. Now, lots of Yemenis have come to me and said, look, the Houthis are terrible. For example, when my family was trapped in Taz, the central city, the Houthis were literally laying siege on the city, just like Russia's doing to Ukraine right now. And I say, absolutely. The Houthis as a government force are just as bad as the Saudis, essentially. And that's not a scientific way to put it. But I mean, they do not have regard for international law, for civilian life, for people's basic human rights. So this is not to say that we should just let the Houthis do whatever they want, or that's the role of the international community, but it's simply to say that Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, has the capacity and the international support to wreak mass devastation. And that's one of the things that I've been very vocal about. But again, there are really no good guys in this conflict, and that's what makes it so tricky. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. So I just want to, again, emphasize just a few of the points that I mentioned, and then we can continue with questions. So as you can see here, the data for 2019, was that only 83% of what Yemen needs in order to fulfill what the United Nations has called for in terms of addressing this world's worst humanitarian crisis has been funded. And I want to emphasize that countries may promise funding, but what they actually end up delivering is often different. And because of the coronavirus, because of what's happening in Ukraine and the other things that are distracting governments, other fires that need to be put out, essentially, what is needed to just keep people alive in Yemen isn't being delivered. And that's being complicated by the fact that Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners put a blockade. Essentially, they stopped aid from coming into Yemen, which is a huge violation of international law. And also the Houthis have been stopping aid or capturing aid for themselves on the ground. And of course, there's a huge problem in terms of capacity, right? Like if you need refrigerators for vaccinations, but you don't have regular electricity, you don't have regular power, then what happens, right? So there's just like a whole host of problems just in terms of protecting people, keeping people fed, getting people housed, cleaning up munitions or cluster bombs that might have fallen, taking care of migrants who are trapped in Yemen from places like Somalia. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So as I mentioned right now, people aren't using famine to address the crisis, but there is, over the vast majority of populated areas in Yemen, an emergency level food insecurity status. One of the issues, though, isn't necessarily that there isn't any food. Of course, the blockades have contributed to this majorly, but Yemen's been fairly agriculturally self-sufficient. Yemenis for a long time have grown all manners of grains, fruits and vegetables, these sorts of things. Part of the problem is, in a war economy, inflation goes insane, right? So an apple might go from costing 50 cents to $100, just to put it in sort of American terms, right? So we have this huge problem in that people who in the cities who can access food oftentimes can't afford it because their money is literally worthless. And then people in the more remote areas, due to bombing, due to other issues, desertification, and a variety, like a host of issues, haven't been able to access food to begin with. So we have a major, major problem there. Also, because of the different forces in power in Yemen right now, or who are continuing to fight for power, and I want to emphasize too that not every single person, like an Aden, for example, is like this, evil actor who's just attempting to govern like a dictator. I mean, there are people, I think, who are trying to get things done as representatives, particularly in Aden and some places in the south. But the problem is there's no real civil society that's able to operate anymore under this extreme sort of set of conditions and this war. So we actually suspect that COVID is having a massive impact, just as cholera and diphtheria and other kinds of preventable, malaria, other kinds of preventable problems are a huge issue in Yemen because of lack of sanitation, lack of clean water, lack of hospitals, the destroyed hospitals. COVID is clearly having an impact. The problem is that in places like Sana'a, the Huthi government isn't allowing people to report on that. So it's almost like some places in China, some places like in North Korea, where there's just like a total denial of the problem. And so the Houthis are really suppressing that information. So the point is, we don't know how bad COVID is in Yemen, but if you can imagine, with all of the disadvantages compounded and layered on top of each other, of course, it's going to have a huge issue. I mean, it's going to have a huge impact. And Aden, that southernmost city I told you about, that was the capital of the south for a long time, might have the highest death rate from COVID in the world as of last year. And again, even though Saudi Arabia at one point was giving a nod to COVID to say, okay, we'll pause the war essentially to allow some relief coming in, that hasn't actually happened. I mean, one staggering, it's like hard with a country like Yemen because with there's so many facts and figures that speak to the magnitude of the crisis. One statistic that really stands out in my mind that I find, to just encapsulate some of this horror is that 50% of the 5,000 hospitals that were in operation in Yemen prior to the war, and we're talking 5,000 hospitals for 30 million people. Some hospitals are just rooms, right? Some hospitals are just like little refrigerated closets. I mean, these are not large hospital systems like we might see in Western states or in the global north. 50% of the 5,000 hospitals have been destroyed just through the bombing campaign. That doesn't include, street fighting. That doesn't include those that have had to close because the doctors have been sick or because they can't find medicine or supplies, right? So, and what I found from the BBC is that for a city of 2.5 million, Sana'a, the capital, they had 16 ICU beds, or they were able to accommodate 16 people in the ICU. So when you think about that, that's it might as well be zero, right? And the heroism, I have to say, of the Yemeni people are continuing to work under these conditions to treat people, both for sort of everyday illnesses and for COVID, when people aren't getting paid. Doctors, teachers haven't been paid for years at this point, and they're still showing up to work oftentimes and doing what they need to do. It's absolutely incredible. And unfortunately, it's not something that gets attention. And again, just like with other kinds of authoritarian governments, Houthis are often not only denying that COVID exists, but sometimes punishing whistleblowers. We've seen this a lot in China and Wuhan and other places. So that is also tragic. And then the last thing I'll say, again, to really acknowledge that lots of different actors are culpable here for this crisis. But really also Human Rights Watch has put out reports about what those actors who are in control, like the Huthi government, have been doing to obstruct co-op, stall, restrict, steal, divert, and even attack aid delivery from the international community. So to the extent to which we can get aid funded, right, and to get relief into the country, despite all of the barriers, is oftentimes not getting to the people that it needs. Now, if anybody is interested in organizations that are able to work and reach people, I know of some that are run by Yemenis themselves, where every dollar, every cent is going to people in need. And I can absolutely, talk to Rima and provide some of that information. But it's just to say is that at every turn, Yemenis are both facing an unprecedented crisis, I would say, in contemporary history, but also showing unprecedented, just completely remarkable resilience and heroism in the face of this, doing absolutely everything they can to survive. And I really appreciate that all of you are here to learn a little bit about this, to learn about the different dimensions of this conflict, which is very complicated, it gets very convoluted, but it's to say is that we can't forget about Yemen. And in fact, every Yemeni person I've met, whether they're Yemeni American, Yemeni British, or whether they're in Yemen themselves, they really do sincerely feel neglected. And particularly now that Ukraine is getting so much attention, right? But Yemen's been going through something that's similar or worse for a long time, not to compare suffering, but there's been a tremendous amount of suffering now for many years that hasn't gotten attention. People really do appreciate our attention and our care for this place, even if we feel helpless sometimes to do anything about it. And any degree of awareness that we can raise among young people today can hopefully inspire folks who are going to be doing future advocacy, future Yemen Peace Project type work, to say, like, we can't forget about this place. It's one of the most special places in the world, and it's also one of the ones that's facing the most tragedy. So it deserves, our continued support, and at least symbolically. And it's 6:04. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe that we did it. Okay, so I'm going to open this up for Q&A, and I'll let our wonderful organizers sort of moderate it. And again, if you have a question and I don't know, we'll find the answer, right? So we'll find it out together. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Moss, for an incredibly dynamic, incredibly informative, and passionate presentation. Very much appreciated. We've all learned a lot. I'm going to open up the floor for questions, remarks in the chat. We welcome them. Dr. Moss wanted to give you ample time to have some back and forth with her. So the floor is open. I wonder if I could start with the question, Professor Moss, while people percolate ideas. Really so much information. I want to go back to your remark and your plea, really, to work on raising awareness amongst youth, amongst students, our audience, our teachers. And so I wonder where you would suggest that they begin concretely. Like, of course, middle students are different from high school students. History is different from geography. We understand that. But if just some entry points that people can just concretely work with to raise awareness amongst youth, and also, to your purpose, to continue to humanize, or yes, to see Yemenis as human beings, heroic human beings.
Thank you, Rima. That's such a beautiful question. I think it probably goes for, Notre Dame, my Notre Dame students, as much as my former University of Pittsburgh students, as much as for any student, which is, I think students really connect with something that's visual, something that really appeals to their different senses. So whether it's exploring, Yemeni art and maybe doing some crafts that way, or watching a documentary like Shake the Dust that really gives a sense of vibrancy where you actually get to know a few Yemenis, is absolutely, I think, the best way to do it. So when I tackle, huge, and you all are the experts in teaching here, I'm just, sort of speaking from my experience in that anytime I have to tackle a really complicated, potentially sensitive topic, I give the students, usually I start with a documentary where they get to know one person, or they get to know a subculture, right? Like the break dancers of Aden Port City. And this really helps them to latch onto something which can seem very abstract, very foreign, very distant, misrepresented as well, and almost maybe too depressing to think about, right? And even just if there's one seed planted where they know where Yemen is and they know a little something about it, what I've found even by very young people is their sort of antennas are raised. So when they come across a news article, they'll be more likely to read it. When they come across a tweet or something on social media about it, they'll be more likely to read it. And I'll also say that if anybody's interested in having, Yemeni people or Yemeni refugees, Yemeni immigrants, Yemeni Americans come speak to their classes, I'm sure that could be facilitated. A lot of people are willing to do this pro bono because they recognize that their country's being neglected. There's a huge issue there. And I think as long as teachers are able to give those guest speakers some sort of guidance in terms of like where the students are at, the kind of information that might be helpful, it's very well received. My Yemen Peace Project partner and director and I went into a classroom in Los Angeles in one of the public schools, just to talk to the students about Yemeni art. And we brought Yemeni scarves with us, and they had so much fun playing dress up with them. And again, it's not to caricaturize a culture, but it's just to say they found it so interesting. They asked great questions. They were really admiring of the beautiful designs on the clothing. And it's just to familiarize it and hopefully, just to keep it in that like mental file cabinet, right? So that they have some sort of interest. I think these days we are flooded with information. We're flooded with crises. I remember growing up, even being, in the Stone Age and analog days, just being like, oh my God, all the animals are about to go extinct, right? There was a big public awareness campaign about elephants and tigers, and even that felt overwhelming. And I had no idea what was going on in the rest of the world. So I can understand why children might be overwhelmed by this information, but at least to have some degree of familiarity with it, I think can go a long way outside of the classroom and in the future as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. Questions are coming in, and I want to make sure that we get to address a number of them. So the first one from Noah: how does Saudi Arabia pressure the UN? If you could speak to that, and also just bearing in mind, I think you have at least 4 more questions in the queue. That's fantastic.
Right. So the United Nations, I mean, and forgive me, I'm just going to kind of speak generally here, operates on the basis of consensus by the global community, by different actors. But of course, we know different actors have different power positions within the United Nations. So there are only some countries, for example, that are on the Security Council. And the UN Security Council has the ability to essentially legitimize invasions and what's the word, like the use of military force. Only some countries have the ability. Saudi Arabia is a big funder of the United Nations, so that makes a big difference. And it's also a big geopolitical power player. So it's able to leverage some of its positions to pressure states and sometimes to bargain with states to say, okay, well, if you don't talk about X, then we'll compromise on Y. So just like any other political process, there are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes, the way the sausage gets made, so to speak, that give them an unfair advantage. And as we've seen, the United Nations is also very trepidatious at times in using inflammatory or language that it perceives to be inflammatory, which is why it's not using certain language when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it's afraid of stoking particular political fires and disagreements that could lead its very fragile consensus system to collapse. So that's sort of the issue in a nutshell. And if you have more questions about that, I can email you scholars who really research these relationships and the sort of Saudi, UN, US relationship to give you more information.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. I think we'll take you up on that generous offer, no doubt. Okay, some questions are more straightforward, and I'll just ask a straightforward one, and then I'll piggyback onto a more complicated one about history. Lise wants to know, is there an archive of the murals? That's a straightforward one, and then I'll ask Owen's question.
Oh, I wish there was an archive of the murals. You know, I've collected some of these photographs that I took myself. I believe that there are some freelance citizen journalists like my friend Atiaf, who took a lot of photos along with her husband Ben and put a lot of them online. So that's something we could talk to Atiaf about. There wasn't, as far as I know, a coordinated effort, but a lot of folks from different countries who experienced the Arab Spring have put together sort of informal collections of the different art that emerged. One thing I found is that there hasn't been an acknowledgement or a collection put together that's made this aspect of the post-revolutionary situation very visible. So thank you for that question. I hope to publish some myself, but I think that what we can do is we can, you know, talk to Atiaf and maybe some other folks in different countries to be able to pull up websites where at least some of this photography is available. And Rima, please don't let me forget about that.
I won't. Thank you so much. I just want to say you've got lots of great praise, very warm praise for your substantive and enthusiastic presentation. So lots of fantastic remarks. And here's a question for you from Owen. Is there a legacy of Ottoman and British imperialism, and how do these compare?
Oh, fabulous question. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to address that, which I completely neglected. Absolutely. So the Ottomans, in addition to a lot of other powers, since, you know, the rise of their empire, have fought to control essentially what is now the Republic of Yemen. But because of the incredibly well-capacity tribal structure, because of the terrain of the mountains of Yemen, very, very difficult for them to succeed in that campaign. So what they did is they primarily were able to colonize sort of around the mountains. So a lot of the coastal areas, the port areas, and the south area of Aden. And so too did the British colonize what became then the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, or South Yemen. And they were in power, the British were in power from, I believe, oh gosh, going the 1839 to 1967. I believe. So the British were in power there for a long time. And what was interesting though is because in the mountainous region and around Sana'a, the Ottomans were not able to colonize it. Part of that part of Yemen became very isolated from sort of the rest of the world that was tied together with this Ottoman structure, which leads to a lot of tensions and differences culturally and politically between sort of areas in North Yemen and South. So I think that's where I'll leave it, but absolutely a huge legacy. Now, what's surprising is, to me at least anyway, coming from a Western perspective where it's like, wow, imperialism was horrible, right? It was wrong, full stop, is that people have a lot of, I found in South Yemen and in Aden, a lot of conflicting feelings about it. Some of them felt like, yeah, the British were terrible, but at least they built hospitals. Right. And I was really struck by the variety of opinions, essentially because the governance in places like South Yemen has been so poor, whoever's been in charge, it's been so poor over time that people do not feel as black or white necessarily about that period as some of us who, you know, learn about this on the outside do. So I found that to be very interesting as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. Okay, 3 more questions. Here's the first. Could partition be a realistic solution?
It depends who would be partitioning what and how that would be enforced. I would say right now, no. The short answer is no. There are just too many actors involved who are claiming power or claiming authority to the whole territory. And even prior to that, North and South Yemen, there was a clear dividing line, but since then, even when South Yemenis mobilized to become independent, they started to fight each other over who would lead that independence and that autonomy in both the 1970s and the 80s and then in the early 90s. So no, not realistic, I would say, unfortunately. Or for better or for worse, really.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. Yeah, sounds so complicated. Amy writes, this was such a great presentation. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions for readings similar to the memoir you showed, or other databases for information about Yemen, both historical and modern?
Oh, sure. Yeah. There are like, sort of encyclopedic, again, I'm not sure what level or for what subject you might be particularly interested in. But if I Google, like Yemen agriculture, a lot of great resources like Britannica type encyclopedia entries come up. Wikipedia actually has some great stuff, although I know we have to be careful about how we teach students to use Wikipedia. There are a lot of really great books that have come out over the past few years about Yemen and the crises that have evolved. There's a really good one by Gregory Johnson about the evolution of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But again, I don't know how accessible that is, because a lot of it's sort of written for the university level or for political science majors. So, if maybe you can send us a little bit more specificity about what level you're interested in, you can absolutely do that. But I would say, even a basic Google search will come up with a lot of great stuff, and it might be a good way to get students involved in doing some research. Even Al Jazeera English and the BBC actually have very good websites where if you go to a news article recently about Yemen, they will list like, what's the history of the conflict? What's the history of imperialism? They will list these video links, which give little 5 to 20 minute video summaries of trying to explain some of these complicated dynamics. And I find that they're useful for university students. They're even useful for me, because sometimes the evolution of these conflicts and the actors involved is so complicated that they provide these kinds of primers that can really help us to understand some of the complexity without too much of the complexity, in other words, making it graspable. So yeah, again, these are things that I can try to help to compile. And but yeah, a lot of the major news organizations, BBC and Al Jazeera English, I highly recommend.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. I want to make sure to read some very appreciative remarks. Rosa says, my students work on a peacemaker project for International Day of Peace, and we highlight Tawakkul Karman every year. Great, yes.
Woo!
I know. And Jennifer says, I learned so much tonight. Thank you for making the information so accessible as a starting point to explore more. So many congratulations. Here's a question for you. Many of them. Okay. Alexandra says, you didn't mention a Sunni Shia division, but emphasized tribal perspectives. Can religion be a lens for understanding?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's an absolutely fabulous question. I think part of the reason scholars like myself, we tend to kind of dance around that is because, unfortunately, there's so much oversimplification when it comes to discussing Sunni Shia differences in the Middle Eastern region. And I know from coming of age in my 20s, listening to this kind of discourse about Iraq and how everything was discussed as Sunni versus Shia, that things became so overly simplified and caricatured that it really completely misrepresented what people were like, their relations prior to war, and how these were playing out. I definitely think religion here matters. I mean, it always matters to some extent, but just like in Syria, just like in Iraq, just like in other places, a lot of times it's used as shorthand to describe differences that aren't really about religious ideas at all. So just to give you an example, the Houthis are part of the Zaydi sect, which is Shia adjacent or Shia related. Most Yemenis, on the other hand, are, I think, over 60% are Sunni. But that sort of religious differences oftentimes map onto tribal identities, regional identities, ethnic identities, and the conflicts that people are having are far less about whose religion should be in charge than about resources, than about governance styles, these sorts of things. So thank you for raising that. Again, I think it's really important. And again, some of the primers like from the BBC and Al Jazeera English explain some of this. And I think we want to understand how important it is. I would say that those differences, while they matter, are secondary in my understanding of the real roots and causes of what's going on right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. We have a few more minutes, and I think I'll pose one since we don't have one in chat, and we can close our session with you with that. You had said something about how the Yemeni American community had been, of course, adversely affected by 9/11. And I wonder if you said you were very open to talking about that. So I wonder if you could share some more about that with us.
Oh, absolutely. So just in the few minutes we have remaining, going all the way back, of course, to 9/11 and prior to that, even though Yemenis were not the primary perpetrators of 9/11, it was actually folks from Saudi Arabia. Just to say that the Yemeni American community and lots of other, of course, Arab and Muslim communities were profiled very seriously by the NYPD, by surveillance, and wiretapping and other kinds of incarceral programs. I mean, things that were essentially violating people's basic civil liberties. Okay. So I say that to set this up to say the kind of discrimination that Yemenis in particular, but also Arab and Muslim Americans are facing is not new. But with the election of President Trump, we saw Yemenis specifically being targeted in two ways. One, through the support of Saudi Arabia and the coalition that's creating the devastation on the ground. And the other in that Yemeni Americans were not allowed to bring their family members over to the United States as refugees to get them out of harm's way. And I know many people, for example, who themselves might have been granted a temporary stay, what's called a TPS, temporary protected status, in the United States to be able to stay out of Yemen, but their family members were stuck in Taz. Their family members were literally under siege and in extreme danger, and sometimes illegally smuggling themselves to Egypt and other places where they were then at risk because they simply had to get out of a war zone. And you can imagine that if your home's destroyed, there's no water, there's no medicine, there are belligerents on every corner, you have to leave to try to survive. There's no other choice. So the Muslim ban, the Trump's travel ban, which went through many different iterations, always targeted Yemen. And over the past few years, even with the very few number of refugees that we accept per year, which under President Trump dipped to only 15,000 per year, literally 2 Yemenis, 1 Yemeni, and then 0 Yemenis over the past 3 years have been allowed into the United States from a war and a devastation that the United States is largely responsible for creating. So Yemeni Americans have been protesting this, and they've also been getting Yemenis in their communities to register to vote. They have been raising their voice on issues related to the war and the refugee crisis and the local discrimination. And there are folks who might be willing to talk to classes about this advocacy. I don't know, but I do know some people who are involved. And I think it's absolutely critical because sort of the Arab Middle Eastern community in the United States, just speaking in terms of hard numbers, is relatively small compared to other racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And a lot of times they're just all lumped together, right, as like Middle Easterners or Arabs or Muslims. But Yemeni Americans, like Syrians and like some other groups, have faced very specific kinds of discrimination that really require their community to mobilize and find their visibility and their voice. So that's been a huge issue. I think it's going to continue to be a huge issue, but I'm hopeful that in places like Michigan, California, New York, Virginia, where a lot of these communities are concentrated, that they are starting to be recognized by their representatives, and there is starting to be a measure of at least local accountability for the ways that they're treated.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Moss, for your time, for your expertise, for your wisdom, for your passion, and for your exuberance. And I know the teachers in our audience feel very similarly, and we will definitely, I'll follow up with you and get some resources, and I will pass them on to our avid audience. Yes, lots of thank yous coming through to you. Thank you so much. So we appreciate your time, we appreciate your expertise, and we will call on you in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah. Well, thank you, Rima, Emma, Kristen, Abdulrahman, everyone for putting on these events. I wish when I was, during my brief stint as a public school teacher, that there were more of these events on foreign issues. And I also wish that more university professors knew more about Yemen. So I'm so grateful to you all. Thank you for all of your labor, your service, your hard work during this incredibly challenging time, and particularly so late in the day. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for attending Yemen's Humanitarian Crisis and War. We have a brief survey. We would love for you to complete it because we're always looking for improvements, always wanting to know what went well for all of you. And please take the survey that Kristen has so kindly dropped into the chat. The Contemporary Middle East in Context series will offer one final session, The Unwinnable War, the US in Afghanistan, with Rosina Ali, journalist and fellow at Type Media Center, on Tuesday, April 5th from 5 until 6:30 p.m. US Eastern Time. Please do expect communication about that session if you have registered. Please expect a follow-up email and the certificate of attendance and today's presentational materials and a link to the recording of the session. We're very happy to share that with you. Finally, thank you once more for joining us today for Yemen's Humanitarian Crisis. Take advantage of our future offerings of professional development in reputable and relevant content about the Middle East. And goodbye for now. Ma salama to each and every one of you. Thank you. Goodbye.